Well, welcome to Spelling and the Brain. I would assume that if you're here, you are here because you are perhaps very interested in spelling, or perhaps you're fascinated with the brain, or possibly you're having difficulties with spellings and brains. It's hard to know why, but it is a fascinating subject. One thing that is rather odd to me is spelling is a very strange thing. When you think about it, it's kind of different than anything else you ever have to learn as an English-speaking person, right? It's really not quite like science, because even though science is a bit messy, it has logic to it. And spelling, well, what is it? You know, I teach in the writing class. It really has nothing to do with language, right? It shouldn't be called a language art because it's not. The four real language arts are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Spelling is not one of those, although we bundle it in the language arts workbooks. We'll try to throw spelling in there. But in truth, it has nothing to do with the language function of the brain, right? It's also not much like handwriting. Handwriting is more like art, isn't it? You know, you practice a pattern and you practice it enough that you can remember the pattern and produce it on demand without looking at anything, and then you practice that enough that you can kind of do it automatically. And again, that has nothing to do with language, and it has nothing to do really with spelling. So I've been trying to define spelling for a long time. I also noticed that it has become increasingly difficult to teach spelling to children in the United States, actually around the world. They have the same problem in New Zealand. And I wondered, why is this? Because really, let's face it, unlike some subjects, spelling has not become any more complicated than it was 100 years ago, right? There may be more words, but we don't know them, so it doesn't really matter. The basic spelling words are the same. And so you could say, well, perhaps English-speaking people are just getting stupid. Now, you could make a pretty good argument for this, especially around election time. But I think there's another reason why it has become increasingly difficult to teach spelling. And you know, if you find any really old teacher, and nobody in this room would qualify, but if you can find someone who is teaching in the system 60 years ago, and you talk to them about the teaching of spelling over their career, they will always concur, yes. From when I started to when I finished, it became harder to get children to spell well. You could also perhaps fault toxins in the air, or additives in the food, or the influence of television. I mean, there's a lot of negative things you could pin it to, but I would like to pin it to the one I believe is most responsible, and that is textbook publishers. Because textbook publishers have, over the past 5 or 6 decades, begun to produce things that did not used to exist, nor did they need to exist, and I believe are an impediment, particularly when it comes to learning spelling. And this would be the workbook, the spelling workbook, the worksheets, the consumable, visually based materials. These did not exist 50 years ago, and they didn't need to exist 50 years ago, at least not to teach spelling. And it was more effective before they did, and it has to do with the definition and nature of what spelling is. What is spelling? So I've been working on this definition, and I have now honed and refined it down to the fewest possible words. You might like to jot this down. I'm rather proud of it. Spelling is the correct retrieval of sequentially stored, virtually random bits of information. And even if you know all of the spelling rules and all of the phonics, those things in and of themselves have a very random quality to young children. I'll say it again, because you might not have got it. And as I say it, in fact, some of you like to copy it. So, as I say it again, please think about the most important word. In that sentence, what's the one key word that would most help you become a better teacher of spelling? Spelling is the correct retrieval of sequentially stored, virtually random bits of information. There you go. Sequential, correct, that's important. Retrieval, that's key. Random, that's interesting. And there's a lot of options there, right? And I don't know there's one right answer. I would propose, though, that in terms of helping us become better teachers, the word sequential is very critical. And the reason is because of what spelling is. In order to spell a word correctly, you not only have to get all the right letters, you have to get them out in the right order, or else it's wrong. And if you've been teaching writing to children for any length of time, you no doubt have seen words like this, or this. This is very popular. I've even seen this. Now, those are not correctly spelled English words. They have all the letters you would need to make a correctly spelled English word, but certainly nobody has ever seen that or learned it intentionally, right? And yet, it's not at all uncommon for a child to write this. And of course, you can usually tell by the context what the word is. But the real question is, where did it come from? Because you see, as I said earlier, one thing we know, you can't get something out of a brain that isn't in there to begin with, right? So, if this is what's coming out, how in the world did it get in there? Because you wouldn't have seen it, unless, of course, you were correcting children's writing papers. But the question is, where did they get it from? And I do believe that a large number of children at a young age, 6, 7, 8 years old, have what we might call immature visual pathways, and they flip stuff, and it moves. Possibly even a majority of 8, 9-year-old boys. You can always tell these kids because they're still kind of flipping their B's and D's, and they're skipping stuff or moving. You might call them mildly dyslexic. I would simply call them not cooked yet. They have immature visual pathways which are not fully developed to the point of getting a consistent image, right? And they're young. They're still working out. Their midbrain's still developing. Their laterality sometimes is still, solidifying. There's lots of visual problems that can occur that are not really problems unless they persist for a long time, but are the result of being young. And so what happens is, when you're reading, there's no guarantee, right, that what's on the page is what gets into your eye, goes through your midbrain, and gets stored in your cortex the way you see it. It can get flipped. So that really, when you see something, right, it's going into your brain all at once, and there's no guarantee that the image is secure, that it's getting stored accurately. Are you with me on this? See, if I show you a word here, I'm going to write a word, and I don't want you to peek, as if you could. And when I say look, I want you to look. Are you ready? Look. Do you see the word? Okay, at the moment you saw the word, the spelling information contained in that word went into your brain simultaneously. There was no sequential storage of it. You with me on this? There's a spatial or a global storage, but it's a simultaneous input. In fact, you can't not see all that at once. You can't force your eyes to look at the letters in order. And as you read more and more, you look at letters less and less, right? And many of you perhaps there was an email, very popular, it was floating around. Harvard research shows that you don't have to spell things correctly in order to read them, and every word was misspelled. As long as you get the first letter and the last letter right, the middle can be completely messed up, and you can still figure out what it is. The reason you can do that is because you have the database of vocabulary. I showed it to all my children. The older ones could read it, the younger ones couldn't. Why? Because the older ones knew there's no such word as that thing. It can't possibly be that word. And then through an almost instantaneous process of elimination, you come up with the only option that would fit in that case, in that syntax. But so the fact is, the more we read, the less we are likely to be looking at letters. And so even less spelling information will come through the visual pathway because it's simultaneous, right? But we know the definition of spelling is what? It's the retrieval, the sequential retrieval of sequentially stored sequential information. Now, how did they used to teach spelling before workbooks existed? Few people know the artifact that keeps us in contact with the method of study that was used is the spelling bee, right? The spelling bee is what shows us the way people used to learn how to spell. And of course, what's notable about a spelling bee is there's no paper involved. It's all a verbal, auditory loop. And this is how people used to study spelling. And you'd get your little list, and you'd get your mom or your partner or your brother or somebody, and you drill each other on this thing verbally, right? See, when you hear a word being spelled out loud, E-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E, you are forced by nature to hear it one letter at a time. You can't not hear it one letter at a time. You can't say all at once. You've got to put it into the brain sequentially. And therefore, the bottom line on teaching spelling is that for most people, not all, but for most people, auditory input of spelling information will be more reliable because it is a sequential input of sequential information than visual input, which is less reliable, particularly for young children whose immature visual pathways can scramble the information in. And if it gets scrambled on the way in, you can be sure it'll be scrambled on the way out. And that's how you get children who will, they'll be in a raise their finger, and I'll come over and I'll say, yes, spelling word, and they'll go, how do you spell this word? And they'll point to it, and I'll say, oh, you got it right. They didn't really know how to spell it. One day they might get it right, the other day they might get it the other way. Right? They don't know how to spell it. They just know it's got those letters because that's what they saw, right? Now, one disclaimer. There is a small number of children, I would say probably no more than 10 to 15%, who are more auditorily confused than they are visually. But it's a very small number. Statistically, with children who have issues or problems or brain injuries at all, they're much more likely to be suffering their visual pathway than their auditory one. And therefore, it's important to note that what I'm saying may not be universally true, but it is generally true for a majority. Do you see? Those children who are auditorily confused generally are the kinesthetic learners, and you've got to have other additional ways of storing information for them, which is even more challenging and difficult as a teacher. But I would say for most everyone, you can follow this idea. If you are teaching spelling and it's going well, and your kids are spelling well, and you are happy with it, keep doing what you're doing. However, if your children are not learning to spell well, they're not spelling well, and you don't feel like they're doing well, and you are unhappy, you must stop what you are doing and do something different. Because you know the classic definition of insanity, to continue to do what you've always done, but expect different results, correct? So if you're not having good success by the method you're using, don't keep doing that when it comes to spelling. It's not a build up a critical mass. It's probably a case of just get more and more confused. So to recap then, we know that spelling is a sequential type of activity. Visual information is not sequential in nature, and therefore won't be as effective for a large number of children. I have personal experience with this. I put one of my children in 3rd grade 1 year as an experiment, and I quickly learned that this school was not going to teach her spelling. They were going to test her every week with long lists of difficult words because it was a rather rigorous academic environment, but they weren't going to teach her how to learn to spell because she came home and showed me a sheet of paper upon which she had copied her spelling words 10 times in an effort to learn them. The only problem was, of course, she had not copied them correctly 10 times. What's even more revealing is she didn't necessarily always copy it the same way wrong. It would kind of mutate in the middle, you know, like a game of telephone, so the one on the end didn't quite resemble the one at the beginning. Now, you could say, okay, this kid, 8 years old, she's lazy, she's not being careful, she's not being meticulous. Truth, though, I don't believe it. What I believe is that the method of trying to learn them that way was relying too much on a visual input. Much like the spelling workbook does. What's the problem with paper? It's all visual. And so what you end up with is this thing of, you know, find it in the word maze, alphabetize the list, you know, fill in the blank, copy it, write it backwards, all this visual stuff, which I'm totally sure would fail many children. I think it would have failed her. So I said, well, if she's going to survive this school and learn these words, I will have to teach her how to spell these words the same way my mother taught me. Now, I am a pretty good speller, but I do not credit at all the Los Angeles school district. I credit my mom. Actually, almost everything I learned, I'm pretty sure I learned from one or the other or both of my parents. But I know she taught me to spell. Because what happened was, you know the old system where you get the list on Monday and then you take it home and you study it. This is a complete joke now because a lot of kids have no clue how to study. They think, oh, if you just stare at it for a while, that would work, right? Anyway, then you take the pre-test on Wednesday or Thursday or something, and if you get 80, 90%, you don't have to take the final. That in itself is a stupid idea. But then you take the test, right? And then next week, whether or not you learned the words from last week, you get a new list. This is sheer idiocy. Because what happens is, of course, the kids who learn to spell, right, they're getting 100%, 95 or 100% every week, and the ones who aren't learning are getting 60% or 50% or less every week. So you get a list, and whether you learn it or not, you go on to the next list. Why? Because you're on a schedule, and here's all the words you got to do in 5th grade. This is idiocy. And the thing, of course, is I always got 100%. Why? Because I'm so smart? I don't think so. It's because my mom is so smart. She wouldn't have let me out of the house Friday morning if she didn't know that I knew how to spell these words. And guess what? I didn't write them one time. She had this little list, and she'd carry it around in her purse, or the refrigerator, I can't remember, probably migrated. And she would just drill me on this stuff, right? And she would say, okay, the next word is special. And I go, special. S-P-E-S-H-I-L. She'd say, not bad, but I got to tell you, this is a weird word, because instead of a S-H, it's got a C-I, so it's probably like Italian or something. And so it's like specia, but the sh is a C-I, and then it's al, like special, so you got to say owl at the end, you know what I mean. And I go, I think I know what you mean. S-P-C-I-A-L. And she'd say, well, not bad. You got the CI part right, but you missed the first vowel, right? Because every syllable has a vowel, special, Oh, yeah, I got it. Okay. S-P-E-C-I-A-L. And she'd go, you got it. Now say it one more time, a little faster, so we know that isn't an accident. Right? And you go, okay. S-P-E-C-I-A-L. And she would do this every day until I could say it. And by the end of the week, I knew that I knew it. And the teacher, and I remember sitting in class, the teacher would say, the next word is special. And I'd be like, I know this. Right? Because I knew it. And I would whisper it to myself. And I'd go, S-P-E-C-I-A. Because I knew if I could say it, I could write it. And I knew that I could say it. Do you see? So I learned how to spell because my mom had the common sense to teach me by that method. She also had the time. Unfortunately, many children today in schools don't have either the method or the time or the parent to do it. And they're kind of left on their own. So if I had to teach school, if someone said, you've got to teach 5th grade this year, right? The first thing I would do is I'd get 2 kids up there and I would teach them how to study. And I'd say, this is how you study spelling. You are the test E. You are the test or. You say the word to him. He tries to spell it to you. If it's correct, you say, you got it right. If it's wrong, you spell it to him and make him repeat it. And you do this until you can spell all 20 words verbally, and that is how you must study if you're going to learn. Now, how did my mom know how to do this? Her mom did it with her. Now, how did her mom know how to do this? Well, that was the method of study that they used in the one-room schoolhouse in Arkansas in the early 1900s, right? That was the method of study. And so I strongly suggest that if you want to have more effective teaching of spelling, you try to get off the paper and into the ear as much as possible. Unless what you're doing is working fine. There are some children, and it just works. You buy a spelling program, and you give it to them, and they do it all, and they love the workbook, and they have a great time, and they learn to spell, and it's effortless. The problem usually is when you have another kid and it doesn't work the same way, and you start to blame yourself. The fact is, the word workbook is an oxymoron. Workbook is an oxymoron because guess what? It doesn't. And a lot of people suffer for several years until they discover this, but I will enlighten you and explain to you why workbooks don't work. It's because a workbook can't adjust itself to the student, right? It has a predetermined repetition, a predetermined pace, a predetermined sequence, and it will keep on going on its happy little way, oblivious to the student using it, whether they are bored to death or completely lost. It will just keep going. Do you see? And so if you happen to get a workbook that works, it's not because it's a great book, it's because you got lucky. It means that that workbook just happened to match that child's learning style and speed and aptitude. And that's only probably going to happen 20 to 30% of the time, which means that 70 to 80% of the time the workbook will fail unless you take control of it. You could use a workbook, but you've got to be in charge of the thing. And if the kid is bored to death, stop doing it and do something else. If the kid is completely lost, stop doing that and review what you need to and stay right there until it becomes easy and then go back and use some more of the workbook. Do you see? The book will only be as good as you make it. But of course, the publishers wouldn't want to tell you that. It sounds like too much work. So textbook publishers try to sell you stuff that looks like it'll work for everybody. And when it doesn't, then they'll sell you some more stuff. And they'll revise it, and they'll keep selling you this stuff forever. And that's part of what's going on in the schools. It's part of why instruction is going down, is because the textbook publishers keep trying to replace the teachers. The good teachers never use the books. So, does that help a bit in understanding the nature of spelling? We're going to come back to spelling at the end and talk a little bit about phonics and what makes really good spellers. But I'd like to interject a bit about the brain. Because when you're learning about anything, you're essentially talking about how do you get information into the brain, how do you get it stored, how do you have it available for use, retrieval. Do you know how the brain works? You've got brain cells, they're called neurons, and you've got about 100 billion neurons and then about another trillion glial cells, which nobody really understands, but these neurons have a nucleus, and then on one side they have axon, and on the other side they have dendrites. They grow out, right? This is a simplistic lesson. The axons of one neuron will connect up with the dendrites of another neuron, right? And you get a little electrochemical reaction there, and they go, right? And they make a little connection, and that's how your brain knows something has happened, right? One of the first things that's likely to happen, let's say you're born, okay? Just born, and you have enough neurons connected to other neurons that you can kind of kick and suck and cry, but other than that, you can't do much, right? But things start happening very quickly. One of the first things that might happen is your mom wants to check and be sure you're okay. So she gives you a little pinch, right? That causes an electrical stimulation to travel up through your nerves into the lower part of your brain where you got a bunch of brain cells waiting around in the area called what it feels like to be pinched, right? And that electrical impulse causes electrochemical stimulation, and the axons of some neurons connect with the dendrites of others, and it goes zzz, and you go, eh, right? But this is not quite the right reaction. So a little while later, just because your mom wants to make sure you're okay, she tries it again. Pinch. This time, because it happened once already, it goes even faster. Right? Into your brain, the axons and dendrites, which did it one time, do it again. Right? And you go, eh. But this is still not quite the right reaction. So, one more time, just to be sure, she pinches you, and and you go, ah! And she's like, okay, she's fine. Now, that's simplistic, but in truth, that is how everything we learn to see or hear or taste or feel or do is stored in the brain through neurons making connections, right? What's really interesting is if you get a permanent neural connection, you have a memory of it, right? And the next time someone comes to pinch, you cry before the pinch because you know what it's going to feel like. You've stored permanently the information called what it feels like to be pinched. Now, there's more than 2 neurons involved. There's whole networks of neurons. But that's it. Do you see it? And so whenever we're teaching anything, whether it's, how to ride a bike or calculus, we're working with neurons making connections. And when the neurons are connected, they store the bits of information, right? And the bottom line is this. The more neurons you have connected to other neurons, the more RAM in your CPU. The more memory, the more intelligence you've got to work with in learning anything. But there are some variables. The first variable is frequency. Frequency simply means repetition. The number of times that something has to happen until you remember it. Right? Some things require very little repetition. What it feels like to be pinched. People learn that one pretty quickly. Right? 6 times 7 is 42. That might require, for some children, a whole lot more repetition. Do you see? But the repetition is necessary in order for the memory or for the knowledge or for the skill to be stored in the brain. Sometimes a repetition of 1 will do it. Other times you need a repetition of 50,000. And that's one of the variables. You with me on this? All right. Another variable. Intensity. Intensity is the power of the stimulation. The reason you only need a small repetition or frequency of being pinched is because it's a high intensity experience, right? The reason you need 6 times 7 is 42 with a higher frequency is because it's a lower intensity experience. You with me on this? Think back to when you were in 4th grade. Try that. If you can't remember, try 5th. And try to think of something you remember from when you were in school in that time. Have you got it? You got some memory? Now, ask yourself, is this what I'm remembering right now an important or an interesting thing? Or sometimes a painful thing? 9 times out of 10, people will say, well, it's interesting. What I remember from 3rd grade, one of my only memories of 3rd grade, is stapling my finger. Now, that's not significant. You could staple your finger and forget that. What I remember was the teacher didn't believe me. And I said, I stapled my finger, and she said, no, you just got a paper cut. And I said, I know for a fact I stapled my finger. And she said, no, you just got a paper cut. And to this day, I have outrage at not being believed by the teacher. And that is my only, well, I have one more memory, of 3rd grade. The other memory is a bit embarrassing, so I won't tell you. But both of them are still there in my brain decades later because of the high intensity. Do you see it? With a repetition of one time, I have permanent remembering because it was such a powerful experience. This does show, by the way, why, if you want to create more intelligent people, you should spend more time doing things that are either interesting or painful. Because you'll get better neural connections, and less time trying to do things that are important but not relevant. You create more brain cell connections. The third variable is duration. Duration is length that the experience or the frequency intensity persist over time, right? And these are always present in something. Sometimes they're more dominant than others. I remember stapling my finger with a repetition of one time and no frequency and no duration because it was so intense. With 6 times 7, I think I had to learn that with a very high frequency because there wasn't a lot of intensity. And fortunately, there's been duration because I've needed the information, so I've never forgotten it. I always think we learn parts of the government by duration, kind of. We can't necessarily say, yes, I remember learning that, like we can say, yep, I learned multiplication in 3rd grade. We somehow hear it here and hear it there and stretch, and hopefully, before we vote, we know there's an executive and a legislative and a judicial branch. Although with the literacy rates Lee was talking about, I suspect it may be a minority of people who know that, but we can't quite pin it to a time or an experience, but it kind of soaked in, right? So frequency, intensity, and duration are always present in learning anything, and you, the teacher, have to be aware of this and use it appropriately, right? Now, I could teach you something. You don't speak Japanese.
Sushi?
No. You don't speak Japanese. Okay, let's say, for example, what's your name?
Janet.
Janet. Let's say, for example, I want to teach Janet the Japanese word for toilet. Could be very handy if she ever goes over there, right?
Yes.
So I say, okay, Janet, here's the deal. I'm going to teach you this word by calling you 10 times a day, every day for the next 3 weeks. Okay? And with a repetition then of how much would that be? 210 times over 3 weeks, I guarantee you she'll know this word, right? In fact, probably after about the 3rd day, she's going to be, I got it, don't call me anymore, right? I'm going to call back. I just want to be sure you remember the Japanese word for toilet, benjo. Can you say that? Benjo. Thank you. Okay, goodbye. I'll call you in 10 minutes, right? Another method would be to say, Janet, teach you this word. I'm only going to say it one time, and you may not ever look it up or ask anyone again. But if you remember it 1 year from today, I will give you tax-free $1 million cash in gold. Will she remember? Yes, I have just created an intensity of experience that she will use her willpower and just force those neurons to make permanent connections because the carrot is that big. Right? Benjo, you got it. 1 year, though. Okay, now, the opposite, I could create a negative intensity. I could say, Janet, here's the deal, and teach you the word. I'm going to say it one time. You can't ask anyone or look it up, but 1 year from now, I'm going to ask you again. If you don't know it, I will kill you. Okay? Now, that would also be intensity, but it wouldn't be as effective, because the fear of death will impede the learning. I could also take that 200 repetitions, and instead of doing it over 3 weeks, I could stretch it out over 3 years, right? And instead of calling you 10 times a day for 3 weeks, if I called you once a day for every, once a week for 3 years, guess what? You remember the rest of your life. Right? You never forget that. Whereas I could squash all that frequency into a narrow period of time, and you would eventually forget if you didn't have reinforcement. You with me on that? So, when one of these is high, the other can be low. Now, let's apply it to spelling. Let's talk about spelling and these variables. Frequency means you need sufficient repetition, and it's going to be very different from child to child. Right? This is why the workbook won't work, because it has a prescribed amount of frequency. It might be enough, but it might not. It might be too much. And then you get bored, and then you don't want to learn anything when you're bored. And so we almost have to customize the program for the child, right? And this whole idea of take the test on Monday, and then study it and take the test on Friday, and whether or not you learn anything, you get a new list on Monday. This is idiocy, because why didn't they learn it? Not enough repetition. What they should do is give the same darn test every day, and as soon as you get 100% twice in a row, so that you know it, then move on to the next list, and don't worry if you get through 32 lists over the course of the year. It'd be much better to get through 10 lists and know that you know all those words, than to charge through 30 lists and have not learned half of them. Now, you might be calculating, saying, wait a minute, 10 would be 100, 10 times 10 would be 100, 30 times 10 would be 300, half of 300 is 150. Wouldn't you learn more if you charged through? No, what you learn is how to not learn, right? Because you learn that it's okay to not learn half of what you're trying to learn. So it's less will be more if you get the mastery here. You with me on this? Now, so frequency, you've got to adjust it for the child. My son, frequency is not his strong point. He needs a lot of repetition. He needs probably 10 to 20 times the repetition on spelling as his little sister, which of course is really irritating. When your sister, who's 3 years younger than you, learns everything 10 times faster in certain areas. The ones we tend to think are important, like spelling and math facts. Fact is, he's an absolute genius in other areas, but we don't, measure, label that, and call it school. One time he said to me, Dad, I found out my best subject. I said, what is it? He said, leaping. All right, intensity, spelling. Intensity in spelling can be done. We often call them mnemonic devices. I before E. You know this because it rhymes, so it's got a little more intensity. But then if you're going to learn that, you've also got to learn all the exceptions, which are rather tedious, because C's doesn't follow the rule, and there's all this other garbage, right? So if you're going to learn a rule, you've got to learn all the exceptions with it, because there is no rule in English that is English spelling that is 100% true. And even if it were, as soon as you get any foreign words, it'll break all that anyway. So the idea of rules is not too good. Instead, what we call them in our program is rule, jingle, or hint. They're these clues, these hints, these things that might help you, but they're not hard and fast rules. And you know how black and white children are. If you make a rule, it's law. And you break your own rule, you are in deep trouble as a parent, right? And when English starts breaking its own rules, it makes children mad. So I don't use rules. But the intensity, another example of intensity, to add in, you can use rhyme or rhythm. You can also use a bit of humor. I oftentimes am teaching a writing class, and one of the activities we'll do is we'll come up with substitutes for said, right? So we'll say, okay, said is a dead word. Now, what are some of the substitutes? You know, screamed, screeched, giggled, whispered. And you always get the word laughed. Well, laughed is a very bad word because logically, if a child wanted to spell laughed and they did not know, they would write L-A-F-T. And that is an absolutely logical thing for a child to do because left is spelled L-E-F-T. So why wouldn't laughed be that, right? So I always say, when you try to write laughed, don't write laughed. Write la-ugha-ed. Now, you laughed at that, demonstrating there's a certain intensity. And I have had children, and their parents came to the seminar and said, my son went home, and he told his dad, Dad, when you try to write laughed, don't write laughed. Write la-ugha-ed, because then you can remember. And besides, there is no word la-ugha-ed, so it's got to be something else, right? And so you get a little intensity. You can build experiences around words. One example, I have a little daughter, not little, she's grown now, she's 17, but when she was my sweet little daughter, I took her on a trip with me to San Diego. Now, the great thing about going on a trip with Dad isn't that you get to sit through writing seminars all day for several days. The great thing about going on a trip with Dad is you get to stay in a hotel. And when you stay in a hotel, there's usually especially in San Diego. And that way, Dad, after teaching writing seminar all day, has to go swim all night. But that's called being a dad, right? So anyway, we're at the hotel, and we're down at the pool, and there's a hot tub, you know, jacuzzi thing, right? And it's got all this foam coming out, right? Somebody dumped way too much chemicals in it. It's this great toxic waste that if your wife were anywhere near you, she wouldn't let you go there, right? But she is far away. So you get in and you play with the foam, right? So we made a little game. Now, whenever I'm with my children, I'm always drilling them on math, facts, and spelling words. They always know, if you ride in the car with Dad, you're going to get drilled on spelling words and multiplication. It's just a thing. That's just called being with Dad, because I'm constantly doing this. And so I'm with her, and I'm trying to think of a hard word, right? So I don't know why I picked it. Maybe I saw one drive by or something, but I was trying to think of a hard word for her to spell. So I said, limousine. She goes, limousine. And she gave it her best shot, probably something like L-I-M-U-Z-I-N-E. That's a pretty logical guess. And I said, nope, I'm so sorry. It's a really strange word. Instead of Z, it has an S. So the end is S-I-N-E, and then it's L-I-M-O-U. There's really no reason for this, but it's a tricky one. Can you say it? L-I-M-O-U-S-I-N-E. So she spelled it, right? Then we played a little game. And the game was, if she got it, I would try to mix her up and go L-I-Q-Z-Z-P-R-V-U-O. And I'd try to mix her up, and then she'd have to spell it back. If she got it right, then she could throw foam in my face. If she got it wrong, I would throw foam in her face, right? So we played this game for a while, and pretty soon I'm getting foamed all the time because she's getting it right every time, so game over. And you go to a different game like make continents with the foam and have wars and all that. But nevertheless, I was kind of curious. About a week later, I walked over to her and I said, hey, do you remember how to spell limousine? And she looked at me and she said, L-I-M-O-U-S-I-N-E. I go, wow, you remember. Because I didn't know if it would stick, right? It wasn't that many repetitions. And it is a weird word. About 6 months later, it occurred to me, I wonder if she knows this word, right? So I walked over to her one day. Now, remember, this is not a word you would ever use. You have no need for the word, especially in my socioeconomic bracket. Right? So it's not one that she likely saw or wrote during this time period. But I walked up to her and I said, limousine. She goes, Dad, do you think I'm ever going to forget that? And I just said, humor me. Can you? She goes, of course, L-I-M-O-U-S-I-N-E. Right? 2 years later, I started to tell this story in this talk, and I thought, I wonder. So I just walked up to her one day and go, limousine, and she just burst out laughing. And then the other day, she walked up to me, and she goes, Dad, you still tell that story? And I go, yep. She goes, L-I-M-O-U-S-I-N-E. So the idea is if you create an intensity where there's a mnemonic or a memory or a sensory experience, then you need less frequency, right? And duration in the teaching of spelling really translates to what? Patience, right? If you can spell today the word receivable without having to think real hard, and some of you can, some of you can't, it's not because you're so smart and not because you remember all the rules about the I before E and do you drop the E if you add an A and all that garbage. You can do it because you've been doing it for decades, right? And you've done it thousands of times over dozens of years. That's why you can do it. And I was interested to note, I moved my house a few years ago. You know when you move, you find stuff that you hadn't thought about for a long time? I found a box that had my college papers when I was a freshman at San Francisco State University, and I was so fascinated to find this thing because I thought, hey, now I can actually check and see if I wrote decently well, you know, when I was 18. So I started reading my papers, and I was very surprised to discover spelling errors in these papers, words which I know I would not misspell right now. Of course, right now I have a spell checker. My children still can't connect with the idea that there were typewriters. Anyway, but I realized, aha, I've even learned to spell as an adult words that I maybe thought I knew or didn't know at 18, because I could recognize that. I would have fixed it if I could have. One word in particular I didn't learn until I was 36 years old. The word was privilege. Privilege. And I'm writing this word privilege. Is it E-G-E or E-D-G-E or I-G-E? Privilege. Privilege. What is it? And I finally thought, this is absolutely stupid. I'm 36 years old and I can't remember how to spell this darn simple word. And so I looked it up and I just hammered it into my brain and I put it there, and every day I said it to myself 1,000 times, said I'm never going to forget how to spell this word. Just forced myself, right? Because I thought it was so stupid. I couldn't spell this word. It's P-R-I-V-I-L-O-L. E-G-E. All right. But the idea then is we have to have patience and understanding. Do you see? So to recap just a bit, spelling is a sequential activity. Visual input is not sequential. It's global, simultaneous. Auditory input is sequential. And if you're going to teach spelling, for most children, not all, this especially doesn't work with deaf children, but for most children, hearing it in sequence will be a more reliable way of storing the information. And then you use these three variables. Understanding that different children need different frequencies, building in mnemonic devices or intensity whenever possible, and then understanding the persistence over time is necessary for spelling to learn. Now, let's talk briefly about phonics and really good spellers. Because people look at phonics as a solution to spelling, and I almost have seen cases where children had too much phonics. I've seen cases where kids are 12 or 13 are in a writing class and they are still spelling everything phonetically. And they're using the phonics rules that they got hammered into them, but they're not spelling it correctly because, let's face it, la-uga ha'ed makes no phonetic sense at all, right? So L-A-F-T does. So if you have been hammered on phonics, you can actually have so much so that you assume that's the only way there is to spell words. And you haven't learned to reprogram that somehow else. Also, I would point out the phonics for encoding and the phonics for decoding need to be taught in a little different way. I will give you an example. Some people are familiar with the writing road to reading approach, and sometimes they use it wrongly, and they use it as the phonogram memorization road to reading approach. And I have seen teachers and people will teach the children all the sounds of A, right? And so what you learn is that AY can say A, AI can say A, EIGH can say A, EA can say A, AE can say A without anything can say A, and A with an E at the end would also say A, and you've got all these great sounds for A. Okay, that's lovely when you're reading, because if you know that, right, and you're reading along and you go, that is one of them A sounds, therefore this word has to be sleigh, especially since I don't know any word called sleighha. Right? That's really useful for reading, but it's almost too much information if you're trying to write the word sleigh. Because you go, I want to write the word sleigh. Well, let's see. It could be AY, could be AI, could be EIGH, could be A with an E, could be EA, could be A with nothing. You got too much information, and plus you've got the nasty problem of, do you want to kill somebody or do you want to ride in the snow? Right? So that is why phonics information needs to be organized differently for spelling. It needs to be organized categorically. The brain stores and remembers information by having connections with other things. Has anyone done ever a memory training course? It's really fascinating because they teach you to remember stuff by connecting it with other stuff, right? Say, well, I'll remember, what was your name? Janet. I'll remember Janet because I'll think that she had red hair and I'll think of jam, a strawberry jam. So next time I see Janet, I'll see that red hair and I'll think of the jam and then I'll say, oh yeah, Janet, that was your name. Right? Now, you can do this. You could, but see, the brain does this naturally by categorizing and connecting bits of information. So when you store spelling information in the brain, you want to store it categorically, right? So if you know a whole bunch of words where EA says E, right? And you know that leaf and bean and pea, the kind you eat, not the kind you do, and treat, right, all say E, right? Then when you get another word, like spear, you go, ah, spear. That's one of them EA words. It goes with leaf, bean, treat, the kind of pea that you eat, right? And you categorize it in your brain, and you connect it up, right? And then you've got your EE words, right? And you go, okay, well, there's tree, and there's pea, the kind that you do, and then there's peel, what you've got to get off the orange, and then there's street, and these all go together. If you don't categorize them, then you don't have anything to attach new information to, and it's very random. Do you see? And so memorizing lists of words, even having little jingles, right? The third girl was the first to see the bird at the birthday party. What have I got? Third girl, birth, bird. I got 4 words all in that little jingle that are reminding me that those are all IR. Why? Because there's no real logic as to why girl is spelled IR rather than UR. Because curl, of course, is spelled CURL, right? And so the IR, UR, ER, those are tough, right? But they become easier if you can attach them, right? There's no reason why street should be EE, but treat is EA. There's absolutely no reason for it. It's random information. Even though there's phonics connected, it's random phonics. Do you agree with me? But if you know that street is where the queen hangs out with 3 bees and an eel under a tree, and you can put all those words together, then you've got it. So this idea of categorization is very, very helpful. we do sell a spelling program which is based on this principle. It's called the Phonetic Zoo, and it is an auditory-based program, and it organizes words into these groupings. It also throws exceptions in. So when you learn the I before E except after C, you also have to spell the word seize, because that's a clear exception to the rule, S-E-I-Z-E, right? Or as the Canadians would say, S-E-I-Z-E. I've actually had people call my office and say, what's this on the spelling program? There's this Z thing. What is it? I just love that, because you get a chance to point out that we are the only English-speaking country on earth that says Z, and everybody else in the whole world says Z for Z. And of course, I went to New Zealand and forgot that and looked like a dumb American, but whatever. Another idea I'd like to quickly show you, and this is something that we are hoping to develop later on, but it's an idea you can grasp. I've had people, just come to this seminar and sit through this little talk, come to a convention and just catch the vision on this and go home and do it. I've had people come to a conference, see this thing, get it, go home, put it up on their wall, come back a year later and tell me it had great success. At the moment, I don't have anything to sell you. I've only got the idea. But it is a great idea. I did not create it. I learned it from Mrs. Ingham, one of my Canadian mentors. And Mrs. Ingham taught first grade for many, many decades. And she understood this whole thing about words needing to be categorized for easy recall, for easy memory, for easy attachment. And so she created this thing called Sound City, where the words live in houses, right? Which of course appeals to the little kid, the whole idea. And the houses are organized by what she called tool sound. So for example, and when you do this, you start with a blank wall. You're going to need a whole wall, so get rid of some pictures, clear off some space, put Sound City on top, but you build it slowly. You don't slap it all up in one day. You build it as you go. So Sound City, one of the first houses that I put in my Sound City when I taught preschool was the OW says ow in the middle of words, right? Can you think of any words where OW says ow in the middle of words? All right, town, towel, clown, foul, the kind you eat, frown. Now, there's a lot, are there not? And so you're never going to put every word that fits in that category in your Sound City. You'd need a skyscraper-sized thing to do it, right? But what you want to do is get enough that it builds the unit of OW says ow words. So if you know town, towel, clown, foul, the kind you eat, and frown are all there, then when you get another word like gown, right? You can go, oh, that's one of them. And you put it with it. And then you got your brown clowns who live downtown always wearing a frown because they got their nightgown. Although it sounds like they lost their nightgown, now they're having to wear their towel. You can build a little story, a little poem, a little jingle, a little mnemonic about this, right? Now, there's other words that have OW. There's quite a few words where OW says O at the end of a word. Can you think of any? Toe, mow, yellow, snow, and throw, which of course is handy because then you realize you should not throw yellow snow. And what I did is I had my little preschool, we actually acted out some of these things. So I got a few little brown nightgowns and I got some yellow tissue paper, and we had a war between the brown clowns who lived downtown and the other guys who were throwing yellow snow back and forth. You can imagine how that created an intensity of experience in my preschool children. They're not going to forget that, right? We also had the squealy E tree, where you had, what words would live under the squealy E tree? Queen, bee. How many bees? 3, obviously. Queen had a pet eel, right? And then when you get another EE word, it was obviously on the street, right? And you can even build streets. You could even have a river running through your Sound City. What would it be called? No, it's a river. They'd be called the Shiver River, obviously. And there's lots of words that break this little E rule, right? They have a short vowel with an E on the end, right? Because live is also live, right? And give is never give. It could be, but it isn't. It's a random fact. Have should, of course, behave. And it does if you behave. But when you get rid of the be, it's only have. That's because it's half of it. Sorry, I'm messing with your head there. So you put in this river, all these words where the E should make the short vowel be a long vowel, but it isn't. It's still a short vowel. Do you see? So you got the Shiver River there. We had a train that was in our Sound City. And I'm not the greatest of artists, but we had the train was called the consonant digraph train, and it had all of the digraphs: CH, PH, TH, oops, CTH, and then of course at the end, caboose, shh. So we had every day a trip to Sound City, all aboard the trip to Sound City, and all the kids would go, ch, 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 shh. Right? You could have an airport. What kind of words would be in your airport? All the ones that share that particular thing. What are they? What are some words? Hair, the kind you have on your head. Chair. And you can make those into little airplanes if you want to. Some of you are more artistic. I'm an artistic flop. But I'll tell you, this idea you build up gradually over time. And it's really good if you have older kids. They're not going to be charmed by it. But if you also have younger kids, you can get it on the wall. And it's not a visual input method. I don't want to be confusing here. It's a geographic organization for the benefit of recall. It's a mnemonic device, categorizing words. I have seen some of the stupidest stuff you can imagine in schools. I saw a spelling book in a 2nd grade that had all the kitchen words connected. Think about this: spoon, fork, cupboard, fridge. Those words have nothing in common linguistically, right? If you wanted to learn them, you should learn spoon and moon and balloon and, right? Because tune could be one of those, and is if it's a cartoon, but most of the time it's an iTune. And it's a different world. You got to organize these by tool sound. Do you see? So, you like that? You could walk out of here and just play with this for a little while, and you know what? Your natural genius would take over, right? Our spelling program isn't doing Sound City, but it's kind of doing a similar thing with the zoo. So we use animals as the house, so to speak, and we categorize words by tool sound that way, so you can take a look. One last thing I want to mention, because it would be a sin of omission to fail this, is just to talk briefly about really good spellers. If you want to get a very, very good speller, then you absolutely need to do certain things. And again, we can learn from the spelling bee. Has anyone watched a spelling bee? Or at least seen a movie? Right? Spellbound is excellent, Aquila and the Bee. What's really interesting about a spelling bee, right, is that kids who win these things are able to spell words that they've never seen or heard before. It's also very humbling to you, isn't it? to watch the spelling bee? Because you're sitting there, you're 40-some years old, and you're thinking, no way. That could not possibly be an English word. I have never heard that word. I'm very literate. I have degrees, whatever. How is it that that is an English word? Of course, you know it must be because it's the Scripps people, and they wouldn't cheat with a non-English word in a spelling bee. But you're kind of amazed. There's so many words you've never heard of before. And then you're very amazed when a little 13-year-old kid spells the word correctly and wins. But if you look at how they think, you can understand better how to teach. When they spell a word, there's 3 bits of information they get to have. What are those 3 bits? Do you remember? The origin, use it in a sentence, so syntax, and the definition. They get these 3 pieces of information, right? So I'm going to tell you the word that won the 1999 spelling bee. And you probably won't know this word. It's very uncommon. The word is logorrhea. Now, you probably couldn't spell this word, but if I tell you what it means, you'll be able to figure it out. It means a pathological condition of talking too much. I like this word because I suffer from it. Now, you should know how to spell it if you can make the connection with the other pathological condition of putting out too much. You with me? Logorrhea. Diarrhea. Right? Exactly. That's where the thing comes from. So then you go logo, well, that's word, that's going to be L-O-G-O. And then you're going to go rhea, well, if you know how to spell the other one, you just transfer the root. Right? So this is why if you want a good speller, you must not neglect to study Greek and Latin word roots. Now, I am a huge fan of Latin, of doing many years of Latin. I think Latin is very, very important. But I also feel that a study of the roots and the vocabulary connected with the roots in English is important. A big chunk, about 40% of all the words in English, have Greek and Latin roots. And then you understand the suffixes and the rules. So if you know chron, you immediately can spell chronology, anachronism, chronic, right? And you got a whole bank of words that you can do with total confidence because you know C-H-R-O-N is the root, right? And if you just do Latin, you'll miss all the Greek. So I strongly recommend a program such as English from the Roots Up, which again is for you to take and teach to children. There's games, Rummy Roots, the card game you can play. That's a good one. There's some flashcard systems. Avenues of the Mind publishes one that's pretty good. My kids like it. But studying the roots is very, very important. And you can do this from a young age. You don't have to start when you can start Latin. I taught word roots to preschoolers who couldn't even read yet. Right? And I had a set of flashcards, and you had like a ship coming in. And I said, this is a port. Port means to carry in Latin, and a port is where a ship which is carrying stuff comes to. Port. Now, there's other words. Do you guys know any? How about import? That's when you bring your lunch into the classroom. Export. That's when you take the garbage out of the classroom. Right? Report, that's where you bring to me, you carry to me the news of what Johnny did to you. Deport, that's what's going to happen to Johnny if he doesn't stop doing it, right? And you can build this thing, right? And you can teach this to very young children if you've got some kind of word lists and systems, right? And so the Greek and Latin word roots are really an extension because the sound city will work with tool sounds or phonic categories. But the Greek and Latin word roots will accommodate another 40% of the whole language. So I strongly recommend that you make that a high priority in your daily life to do something with word roots a little bit every day, even if you're doing Latin. And it's so fun because you get those aha moments, those connections. And that's why Latin is such a fun language for kids. They're like, oh, that means that, and that's why we have these words. And it's so much fun, right? And you see that also happen if you got the Greek roots. So I would strongly recommend that. So Hopefully then, that's some useful information about spelling, the nature of what it is, sequential activity, and how to get it into the brain, auditory pathway perhaps better, frequency, intensity, and duration. That principle you can apply to teaching everything. And then when you do help to organize the information inside the brain, do it by phonic grouping or category, and don't neglect the study of word roots. And I am very convinced that almost anyone can learn to spell. And that, you know, there's a higher aptitude and a lower aptitude. But if you teach it correctly, everybody can get better. It's not going to be that kind of thing where only some people can learn it well. So I hope that's useful. And we'll take a little break right now, and we'll come back for teaching boys and other kids who would rather be making forts all day.